Welcome back to Confessions of a Thai Monk. We're here in Banja Luka at the Laszlo Institute of New Paradigm Research, and we're participating in a think tank and symposium on new paradigms in education. And today we have the pleasure of actually sitting down with a patron of this particular symposium, a man by the name of Lawrence Bloom. And Lawrence is both a visionary and self-describes himself as a mega connector. So, Lawrence, let's start with what exactly do you mean by mega connector?
Right. Thanks for the question. Ever since I was a kid, I saw things in patterns. And when I meet people where I feel by joining them together, their impact could be much greater than working separately, then I use my influence to connect them together and to see how the combined offering can fit into a series of major projects.
And we should say you're doing this, though, within the consciousness movement.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, why now? Why are we in this discussion around consciousness now? And what's your contribution to that?
Okay. So there are three converging crises: economic, social, and financial. They look separate, but they're not separate at all. They stem from a deeper crisis, which is a crisis in values. And that crisis itself stems from an even deeper crisis, which is a crisis in our worldview. So every time we see ourselves as separate, as disconnected, as apart from each other, we're on a path of fracture, breakdown, conflict, and dissipation. Every time we see ourselves as one humanity, we're on a path of abundance, of hope, of joy, and of fulfillment. So the issue that we need to address is at the level of consciousness. It's at the level of the lens through which we see the world. And the last 300 or 400 years, with the advent of Descartes and Newtonian physics, has led us to analyze and reanalyze. And we're so busy analyzing the music, we've forgotten how to dance.
That's a beautiful metaphor for this. So we're often at similar conferences. Is your perception right now that a critical number of people on the planet are reaching a level of consciousness where this work can happen? Is this happening hand in hand with the crises? How are the two related?
Yeah. There's a number of ways of answering this question. There are those of us who would believe that the Earth is on a 26,000-year trajectory around a central sun. That trajectory is not circular, it's elliptic. And as we approach the central sun, our consciousness increases, and as we go away from the central sun, our consciousness diminishes. So if you look at the Vedas, they talk of the various ages, the Iron Age, the Silver Age, the Golden Age, and then Kali Yuga, the Dark Age. And many people believe that we're actually emerging from the Iron Age now and very close to the Silver Age. And we're in that moment of transition. However, it's a very, very dangerous time because it's a time when science outruns wisdom. And at that moment, unless we have the capacity to raise our consciousness, then the technology that we have created will overwhelm us and destroy the systems that enable us to live. So we're at that place where I often get asked, Lawrence, will you talk about the planet in peril? And I say, it isn't the planet that's in peril. The planet's been here 4.5 billion years. It'll probably be here another 4.5 billion years before our sun becomes a red dwarf and absorbs it. What's in peril is its capacity to sustain human life. And so we probably now have a window, I would suggest much shorter than many people believe, where we have to come into harmony with those ecosystems that nurture and protect human life.
That window that we're speaking about, I'm hearing from many people in different wisdom traditions, we're not talking about decades, we're talking about a few years right now.
Yeah, if you look at the 4 nations, in particular the Kogi, they give a date around 2026, and various other traditions harmonize around that time. So we have something like 9 years left, according to those ancient wisdom traditions.
Lawrence, if you go back, and I want to go back to your childhood, did you have a sense from the time you were a young person of having some sort of a mission and purpose at this time?
Yeah, 100%. And in fact, people say, are you doing this for your children? And I have to be honest, the answer is no. It's a compulsion. I've had moments of huge difficulty, massive difficulty, but I just keep getting up again and getting on with it, because the purpose that I see for myself and tens of thousands of others, it's not an easy path. In fact, my Skype little message reads, the butterflies always win, but it's going to be a bumpy road. And so you know the story about the caterpillar and how within the body of the caterpillar, imaginal cells arise that have the vision of the butterfly, carry the DNA of the butterfly. The immune system of the caterpillar sees them as foreign and immediately tries to destroy them. At the last days of its life as a caterpillar, the caterpillar consumes up to 50 times its own body weight every day, so that its own immune system is threatened. And the shock of the increasing numbers of imaginal cells that hold the vision of the butterfly, plus its own diminishing immune system capacity, means that the entire inner system of the caterpillar goes into chaos really, and in that chaos, the DNA of the butterfly takes over, and as we know from biology and our own experiences, the butterfly emerges. So we are the imaginal cells in the body of the caterpillar. We are the ones that hold a different vision for society. You couldn't get more different from a caterpillar to a butterfly, or the system that we will be emerging from and the system we'll be realizing. What we are is we're midwives of a new age, where we're both the parent, or the mother, the emerging child, and the midwife itself.
So that leads me to a question around how we're at this critical stage where these imaginal cells have to become intermeshed and interconnected in a more significant way.
Yeah.
So does that bring us to what you feel your role is in this, being part of that connecting tissue?
Absolutely right. That's exactly right. And that's the critical mass that you're talking about. And that critical mass enables the system to transcend itself. The Maharishi says that it takes the square root of 1% of the population to effect that transition, that shift in consciousness. There are other traditions that say that those that reach a level of consciousness will live on the planet that they're creating, and those that haven't will be left to go around for another cycle. So there are many interpretations of the end game, but one thing is for sure, we are in the end game.
I really appreciate you sitting down to speak with us about this, and I hope that we can also do this again in May or July when we come back to this next conference. And I want you to update us on where things are in terms of this interconnectivity. We've seen each other in Tyringham Hall with the work connecting Dr. Don Beck and Barbara Marks Hubbard. So I believe we're seeing this interconnection starting to happen, but I think there's an imperative to accelerate this now. And do you have a vision around how we can accelerate this now?
Indeed, I do. I met Barbara Marx Hubbard in the 80s, late 80s, when she was talking about a time when the media and dinner parties would be obsessed with what's breaking down, what isn't working. And we really reached that time now. And she was saying, you know what? We're focused on the wrong thing. We're focused on what's breaking down, and we should be focused on what's breaking through. We should be focused on what's trying to emerge. So how do you capture what's trying to emerge and be able to gift it and spread it throughout humanity? What has the capacity of being taken to scale? And what protection does it need against the old system? Because if it's disruptive and threatens the old system, in which there are huge capital and cultural investment, then it's likely to be sidelined. So how do you protect it? How do you nurture it? How do you protect it commercially? How do you protect it financially, in media terms, and so on? So in the old days, you called it the Peace Room, but now we've renamed it the Office for the Future. And I've...
The Office for the Future.
Office for the Future.
Yes.
And I've taken the role of chairman of that office, and we're looking to embed it in the Secretary General's office at the United Nations, and in as many communities, emerging communities, as we can, to empower them to explain what they need, because it's at the community level that we really will begin to understand what's needed. It's never at the administration level, government level, unfortunately.
So this, you know, we actually live in a community. We live in the community of Damanhur, and we're also connected to the community of Tamara. So I'm quite well aware of these communities having been working for 30 and 40 years and developing technology and knowledge that I think is critical for the rest of humanity now. Do you have advice to these communities on how, because they've been focused on building themselves into resilience, and now are starting to look outward in terms of how they can communicate with the world. Do you have advice to the communities around this?
It's an amazing conversation, because it's actually emerging. I had never thought of that before, you see, because communities which are embedded within cities, that are embedded within states, that are embedded within nations, which are embedded within the United Nations, is a pathway of empowerment that one can trace. What you're a part of is an oasis of light in a sea of darkness, and there are many, many oases of light like yours that aren't in a discernible path to empowerment. So this is a really interesting question.
We are emergent realities.
Yeah.
This conversation we've had with Jude Coravan, physicist, speaking about the idea that as something is collapsing in terms of physics, there's always something that's happening new. And the attractor cells from what's breaking down need to be able to see this to move into it.
So this is interesting. This is a kind of decision I'm making in this interview. I was much influenced by a guy called Ken Carey, who wrote a series of books starting with starseed transmission. I think in the 80s maybe. Yes, in the 80s. And I met with him for 3 days in Iona. And he planted some thoughts in my mind. This is where he was talking about the emergence of communities like Damanhur, like Tamara, that, as I say, would be oases of light in the sea of darkness. I would like to consider how we can embed the wisdom of what you have within the Office for the Future. And that could be, I'm sure there is already a linking mechanism, but that could perhaps provide the infrastructure to bring the thoughts into the global mainstream, because media is going to be a big part of what the office does, and we're currently, I'm going to say confidentially, one can hardly say confidentially on an interview, but we're looking at working with some amazing people in media and PR coming together in a new vehicle to promote new consciousness.
That's very exciting. That's been part of our focus, is trying to give a voice to this movement that hasn't had a strong voice in the mainstream. And of course, Dr. Don Beck's work around this, in terms of how do you speak beyond a worldview that's existing for someone and translate. So there's a translation process that has to happen as well.
So that's critical to this discussion. And Don and Barbara were brought together by Marianne Thompson, and I was very much part of that process. So Don is inherently invested in the office, and in the same way, of course, as Barbara is. So we need to have that capacity to translate from one culture to another in a way that that second culture can understand. Yeah, that's also critical to the process.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with others, others in our audience who are beginning to hear this wake-up call, but don't have an idea of how to move from being in an individual story into a more collective story? Do you have any advice for those people who are feeling this right now?
I think if we understand that, I had a friend called Willis Harman who wrote a book called Global Mind Change, and one of the chapters was this world isn't stranger than you can imagine. This world is stranger than you can imagine. You can imagine. and Tal de Chardin talks about a noosphere. A noosphere is a realm of thought. So we start off with the geosphere, which is when the gases cool and create solid matter. Then it rains, and the hydrosphere and the geosphere together create the biosphere. And then biosphere creates life. And life, I won't say life creates thought, because thought creates all of what I'm talking about, but the realm of individual thought, that Tal de Chardin called the noosphere. Mm-hmm. And there would come a time when the noosphere would be replicated on Earth, which seemed an extraordinary idea. But of course it is with the internet. So you have the mirror of a realm of thought out there, in an interconnected global realm of thought, in the ether, and then you have the internet, which is an interconnected, continuing realm of thought. So sometimes we think into the noosphere, so sometimes we think it, and other times it thinks us. Mm. And that's the concept of critical mass. When there's enough of the noosphere that's coherent, thinking us, then we start to shift in our perception and understanding of the world. So one would argue that the Renaissance, when we stopped believing that the Earth was flat and that we were the center of the universe and that the sun went around us, was the predominant thought. But the emergence of a new set of thinking with Copernicus and Galileo impacted the noosphere so strongly that it then impacted individual thought. Mm. So we're at that time again, that brought us out of the Dark Ages, and where we are now will prevent us going back there. So in specific answer to your question, having given the background to how I see the question, in specific answer to your question, the capacity to connect is becoming more and more important. The capacity to find like-minded people is becoming more and more important. The capacity to put your drop in the bucket of a bucket which is already heading in your direction is becoming more and more important. This is not a time for separateness. This is not a time for isolation. This is a time for collaboration, communication, transformation, and transcendence.
Thank you. I think those are words that would be quite inspiring for many people who are at this stage not quite knowing where to turn and yet trusting this path, I think, is the key.
Yeah. And I believe that those communities like Damanhur and like Tamera are oases of light. And for those who are a little lost, they need to find their way to those oases, perhaps in the first stage.
Yes, I appreciate that, and would also share that these are communities that are open to people who are looking for a different kind of society and culture, and are pioneering this path into a new and more connected world.
Yeah. I mean, I was very privileged. I was at Damanhur twice, and once for some very extraordinary synchronicity, I spent an hour and a half with Falco talking about the future. And his idea of this World Parliament,
yes,
which I think will evolve over a period of time, but will be a pure reflection of the needs of communities and not the needs of the power elite.
Yes, this is the temple of the peoples. This is a temple. This is the future temple project in Damanhur, where we're working to build a temple that will be a connecting point for all of the indigenous peoples in the world, all of the popolo in the world who are carrying wisdom that is being lost on a daily basis. So the idea is to create a container where all of that wisdom can be housed in a place, and there can be a parliament of the people, of the indigenous peoples of the world.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's a very important project within Damanhur.
So this is very exciting. In fact, again, is bringing me to another level of understanding in this conversation. One of the prime objectives and aspirations of the Media PR Group is to restore the dignity of the indigenous peoples. At the moment, they are treated like the bearded lady in the circus, as some aberration. Not only are they not an aberration, they're our way to the future.
They're carrying the wisdom to take us into the future.
Exactly right. Yeah. So the first objective of the media group is to restore the dignity to the indigenous peoples. Once you do that, you restore credibility to their message. Until you do that, you can't. So that's the prime motivation for creating this media PR group, to be able to bring into the mainstream the wisdom about the connectedness of all things that is held within the indigenous community cultures.
Gosh, Lawrence, we could sit here and speak all morning, and I would appreciate that.
We'll follow up.
I appreciate you sitting down with us.
Oh, it's a privilege.
And I hope our audience will enjoy our conversation. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you for joining us.
It's a privilege, and always would love to at any invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.